stop that changed everything. A truck driver gets pulled over for a winter safety check. Standard procedure, papers in order, lights working, nothing unusual. But then the officer notices something that doesn't add up. And what they find hidden inside that trailer will expose one of the most chilling criminal operations in American history. Stay with me on this one, because what started as a routine stop at 4:19 in the morning is about to unravel a network so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in everyday life that federal officials would later call it a national security threat. 4:19 a.m., southern Minnesota, a frozen stretch of Highway 52. A semi-truck eases onto the shoulder. Just another precaution on an icy road. The driver is calm, cooperative. He hands over his papers. Lights get checked. To anyone passing by, nothing worth a second glance. But then, small things stop adding up. The load logs don't match the weight. The distribution along the trailer feels wrong. The chassis sounds hollow where it shouldn't. When inspectors drill into the sidewall, they don't hit insulation. They don't hit steel reinforcement. They break into a concealed compartment running the full length of the truck. Inside, tightly packed bricks of cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, sealed with industrial precision. And behind the drugs, hidden from light and air, officers find 12 children, dehydrated, silent, terrified. In that instant, a winter traffic stop ends, and a national security investigation begins. But here's where it gets stranger. The driver doesn't panic, doesn't argue, doesn't ask for a lawyer. Instead, seated in the heated cab while state troopers secure the scene, he asks a single question: who else knows? That question shifted everything. What officers had stopped on Highway 52 was no longer a single criminal act. It was a controlled component of something much, much larger. And investigators were about to discover just how deep this thing went. Within the first hour, federal task forces began cross-checking the vehicle. The truck was registered to North Star Hauling, a regional carrier with legitimate contracts moving food, fuel, and industrial supplies across Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. On paper, everything looked clean, but the driver's route told a different story. GPS data showed he had driven the same corridor at the same hours, regardless of weather, fuel prices, or delivery demand. Phone records revealed repeated contact with 2 dispatch numbers not listed in North Star's official system. Maintenance logs showed recent chassis modifications approved outside standard safety channels. And then came the confirmation that changed everything. 2 other North Star trucks running identical trailers were flagged within hours on separate highways. Both showed the same weight anomalies. Both were linked to the same off-book dispatch signals. This wasn't a rogue driver. This was a coordinated transport system hiding inside a trusted company, moving drugs and children under the cover of everyday commerce. By nightfall, what began as a single traffic stop had expanded into a multi-agency investigation spanning 5 states. Analysts pulled 3 years of shipping data linked to North Star Hauling, and the pattern that emerged, it stunned even veteran investigators. Out of more than 600 registered drivers, a specific group of 41 trucks stood apart. They ran fixed routes at fixed hours, regardless of storms, fuel prices, or delivery demand. While legitimate drivers adjusted schedules weekly, this group never deviated, logging nearly 120,000 miles per truck per year. Same corridors, same timing. Over 36 months, that amounted to more than 4.9 million miles of controlled movement across the Midwest. Most people would never notice, but here's the problem. Weight sensors told the next story. On paper, these trailers carried consumer goods. In reality, forensic modeling showed up to 480 kilograms of concealed cargo per run, hidden inside modified chassis compartments, invisible to standard inspections. At peak winter activity, investigators estimate 2 to 3 runs per night, moving over 1.2 metric tons of narcotics per week. And this is where everything changes. The financial trail delivered the next shock. Shell vendors tied to maintenance and fuel reimbursements funneled money into fragmented accounts, designed specifically to avoid federal alerts. When aggregated, the flow revealed over $92 million laundered through layered transactions, each transfer broken into amounts under $9,000 to appear like routine remittances. The funds didn't stay domestic. They exited the U.S. within hours, routed through informal networks that left no conventional banking trail. But the most chilling discovery wasn't about money. It was about people. Recovered schedules listed coded units, later confirmed to represent children, transported alongside narcotics, rotated between hubs to avoid patterns. Internal tallies suggested at least 60 minors moved in the past year alone. None recorded in any commercial manifest. This wasn't smuggling. This was parallel logistics, an industrialized system embedded inside the economy, moving drugs, money, and children with the same efficiency used to deliver food and fuel. By the third day, federal briefings reached a conclusion no one wanted to say out loud. This network could not be dismantled piece by piece. Analysts projected that arresting even 5 drivers would trigger an immediate shutdown, routes erased, phones burned, money gone within hours. Based on movement data, investigators estimated the operation was generating $18 to $22 million every 6 months, with enough narcotics in circulation to poison entire metro regions. Senior officials from the Department of Justice and Homeland Security received the assessment. It was blunt. This was no longer a drug case. It was a national security threat embedded inside America's supply chain. The order came down fast. There would be no staggered arrests, no warning seizures, no leaks. Instead, a single synchronized strike across 5 states, targeting every truck, every dispatcher, every facility in one night. If even one note escaped, the system would survive. So the decision was made. End it all at once. The first trucks were already moving when the storm reached full force. Snow hammered the highways. Lane markings disappeared. Visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. Wind pushed against the trailers like a living thing. To anyone watching traffic cameras, it looked like a night when nothing should have been moving. But that was exactly why the network was active. At 1:58 a.m., 3 North Star rigs pushed north along interstate corridors flagged for months. Inside the command center, their icons pulsed steadily across digital maps. No deviations, no hesitation, fully loaded. At 2:03 a.m., State Patrol units slid into position behind them, unmarked, lights dark, engines throttled low. The drivers never saw them coming. When the box maneuver closed, there was no room to accelerate, no shoulder to escape. Snow plows were blocking the exits. Within seconds, the trucks were forced onto frozen pavement. Air brakes screamed. Doors opened. Tactical officers climbed into cabs before radios could be reached. Drivers were pulled down into knee-deep snow, zip-tied and separated under floodlights cutting through the whiteout. Inside the trailers, cutting tools met reinforced steel, the same hidden voids, the same industrial packing, the same unmistakable smell of narcotics. And at that same moment, hundreds of miles away, the second phase detonated. 2:17 a.m., armored vehicles breached the perimeter of a primary logistics facility outside Minneapolis. Chain link fencing folded, floodlights snapped on, federal teams poured into loading bays as flashbangs echoed off steel walls. Night shift workers froze where they stood, hands raised, faces pale in the strobing light. Dispatch offices were secured first. Computers seized while screens still displayed live routes. Hard drives unplugged mid-transfer. In a locked back room, agents found handwritten schedules, coded in dates, weights, and symbols. Entries that investigators now recognized as shipment counts, transfer windows, and human cargo rotations. By 2:41 a.m., secondary hubs were falling across multiple states. A repair shop in South Dakota revealed a concealed holding area. A quiet industrial lot outside Chicago yielded a truck loaded and ready to depart. One driver ran. He made it less than 20 yards before a K-9 unit brought him down in the snow. As the arrests mounted, the scope became undeniable. Trailers held narcotics by the hundreds of kilograms. Cash sealed for transport. Modified compartments designed not for hours, but for days. In one seized vehicle, officers found water bottles counted and rationed. In another, blankets stacked beside restraints. The system was built for repetition. By 3:30 a.m., the network stopped moving. Routes went dark one by one as trucks were immobilized and dispatch lines severed. Financial task forces froze accounts in synchronized waves, locking down funds before automated transfers could trigger. Mechanics, dispatchers, supervisors, all taken into custody as evidence teams cataloged every detail. As dawn approached, snow continued to fall, but the movement beneath it was over. What had once looked like ordinary commerce, trucks running quietly through the Midwest, had been exposed as something far darker. And for the first time since the operation began, there was no traffic to track, no signal to follow. When the arrests were complete and the last routes went dark, the real work began. By mid-morning, forensic teams had secured more than a dozen trailers, 3 primary warehouses, and multiple satellite facilities spread across the Midwest. What they uncovered inside those sealed spaces reframed the entire case. This was not a series of isolated crimes. It was a repeatable system built for scale. Inside the modified trailers, engineers documented false wall compartments running the full length of each chassis, reinforced with hydraulic panels and sound-dampening insulation. Each compartment could carry up to 500 kilograms of concealed cargo, while still passing basic roadside inspections. Residue analysis confirmed repeated exposure to fentanyl, cocaine, and heroin. Evidence these vehicles had been used dozens of times, not once. But the most disturbing discoveries weren't chemical. In 2 seized trailers, investigators found signs of prolonged human confinement. Ventilation slits disguised as structural seams, water containers measured and rationed, food packaging counted in strict intervals. The configuration made one fact unavoidable. These compartments were designed to hold people for hours, sometimes days, without detection. Medical examiners later confirmed that at least 12 rescued children showed symptoms consistent with repeated transport, severe dehydration, hypothermia exposure, and stress injuries that could not have occurred in a single trip. Warehouse searches deepened the picture. In a locked office adjacent to a loading bay, agents recovered handwritten ledgers and encrypted storage devices. The ledgers listed shipment cycles coded by color and symbol. Once decrypted, analysts matched entries to known seizure dates and confirmed movements. Over an 18-month period, the system had logged more than 70 successful runs, moving narcotics and human cargo across at least 6 interstate corridors. Financial forensics delivered the next shock. Transaction records showed profits from each run were immediately fragmented, split into hundreds of transfers under reporting thresholds. When reconstructed, investigators identified tens of millions of dollars flowing through layered shell entities before disappearing into informal transfer networks abroad. None of the funds were reinvested locally. The operation was extracting value, not building a business. Then came the digital evidence. Seized servers revealed a dual dispatch platform. One side mirrored legitimate freight operations. The other, accessible only through encrypted credentials, tracked covert routes, timing windows, and load priorities. Alerts warned drivers of enforcement shifts, weather changes, inspection slowdowns. The system treated snowstorms and highway closures not as risks, but as opportunities. As evidence rooms filled, prosecutors reached a sobering conclusion. This network hadn't exploited a weakness in the system, it had studied it. It understood enforcement patterns, seasonal strain, economic dependence on freight movement. It embedded itself so deeply into routine commerce that removing it disrupted legitimate supply chains across multiple states. By the end of the day, one fact was clear. The trucks hadn't been moving randomly through America's highways. They had been operating with purpose, quietly, repeatedly, with devastating efficiency. By the time the sun finally broke through the retreating storm clouds, the scale of what had been uncovered could no longer be contained inside evidence rooms and briefing binders. This case was no longer defined by arrests or seizures. It was defined by what it revealed about vulnerability. For years, the network had moved through the Midwest without resistance, not because it was invisible, but because it looked familiar. Branded trucks, valid paperwork, routine roads. The same vehicles that delivered food to grocery stores and fuel to heating plants had been used to move narcotics and children under the cover of normal commerce. The threat wasn't hidden at the border. It was already inside. As federal authorities froze assets and padlocked facilities, the collateral impact rippled outward. Legitimate shipments were stranded mid-route. Distribution schedules collapsed. Small towns waited on delayed deliveries as investigators worked through impounded trailers one by one. The disruption was immediate and instructive. Removing the network proved just how deeply it had embedded itself into everyday economic life. Policy reviews followed within days. Regulators began asking questions that had long gone unchallenged. How could fixed, non-commercial routes operate for years without triggering alerts? How could millions move offshore in fragmented transfers without coordinated oversight? Why were seasonal enforcement gaps so predictable that criminal planners could design schedules around them? The answers were uncomfortable. The system had been optimized for speed, efficiency, and trust. It assumed compliance. It relied on patterns, and that reliance had been exploited. The network didn't break the rules in obvious ways. It lived just inside them, bending procedures without crossing thresholds that would trigger alarms. For investigators, the lesson was stark. National security was no longer confined to borders, ports, or airports. It now ran along interstates, through freight depots, across frozen highways at 3 chaos in the morning. The infrastructure that kept the country moving could also be turned against it. In closed-door briefings, officials acknowledged this case would change how transportation security was understood. New oversight protocols were drafted. Data-sharing barriers were reevaluated. Winter enforcement models were rewritten. The goal was no longer simply to catch criminals after the fact, but to prevent parallel systems from forming undetected. As for those responsible, indictments followed, charges ranging from narcotics trafficking and human exploitation to money laundering and conspiracy across state lines. The trucks that once rolled quietly through snowstorms now sat motionless in impound lots, tagged as evidence. What remained was a final realization. This investigation had begun with a routine stop on an icy road. No alarms, no warning signs, just an officer doing his job in the dark and the cold. That moment exposed a truth with national consequences. In a system built on movement and trust, vigilance in the most ordinary places may be the last line of defense. And on America's highways, the silence now carried a different meaning. When the operation ended, there was no celebration. No press conference, no victory speeches, no cameras waiting at dawn. Instead, silence. Along the highways of the Midwest, the familiar rumble of overnight freight traffic thinned to almost nothing. Snowplows continued their routes. State patrol vehicles moved as they always had. But the trucks that once ran with clockwork precision at fixed hours on fixed corridors were gone. Interstates that had carried hidden cargo for years now carried only wind. In impound lots across 5 states, dozens of trailers sat motionless behind chain-link fences. Doors sealed, license plates tagged, snow gathering along tires as evidence markers fluttered in the cold. To anyone passing by, they looked like nothing more than idle equipment waiting for paperwork to clear. But investigators knew better. Those trailers had not been idle. They had been active, purposeful, repeated. For years, they had moved through storms that grounded flights and closed roads, past way stations without incident, parked at rest stops beside legitimate carriers delivering groceries, heating fuel, and medical supplies. Nothing about them had drawn attention, because nothing about them had seemed unusual. That was the most unsettling discovery of all. The system hadn't relied on secrecy. It had relied on normalcy. Inside shuttered warehouses, the lights were now off. Dispatch rooms that once pulsed with screens and signals sat dark. Computers frozen mid-log, coffee cups abandoned on desks. Routes memorized down to the minute no longer existed. Phones that once coordinated movement across hundreds of miles were silent. Numbers disconnected. Histories preserved only in evidence files. For the first time in years, nothing was moving. And yet, the absence itself raised questions no arrest could answer. How many routes like these had operated without detection? How many times had enforcement passed within yards of something catastrophic without realizing it? How many systems had learned how to blend so perfectly into daily life that no one thought to look twice? In closed briefings, officials acknowledged what could not be said publicly. This network had not been an anomaly. It had been a case study. a demonstration of how modern infrastructure, designed for efficiency, trust, and speed, could be turned quietly against the society it served. There were no dramatic endings for those who dismantled it. Investigators returned to desks, analysts filed reports, prosecutors began the slow work of building cases that would take years to resolve. The rescued children were transferred out of sight into care systems that would never make headlines. Life resumed. But something fundamental had shifted. Every empty highway at night now carried a different meaning. Every truck moving steadily through snowstorms invited a second look. Every routine stop held the possibility that something ordinary might conceal something unimaginable. The operation had ended. The roads had gone dark. Yet the silence left behind wasn't comforting. It was a reminder. In a nation built on movement, vigilance doesn't always announce itself with sirens or alarms. Sometimes it begins with a single officer on a frozen road, noticing something that feels wrong and refusing to look away. This case didn't end with the last arrest or the final seizure. Its true impact lay in the lesson it exposed. For years, the network moved freely, not because it was powerful, but because it was familiar. It wore the appearance of routine. It followed the rhythms of daily life. It operated inside systems built on trust, efficiency, and the assumption that most people follow the rules. That assumption, investigators learned, had become the greatest vulnerability of all. There were no forged documents, no dramatic border crossings, no obvious red flags. Everything existed just inside acceptable limits, weights just below thresholds, transactions just under reporting requirements, routes that looked repetitive but not suspicious. The system didn't break the rules. It studied them, then learned how to live within them. The lesson isn't that oversight failed. It's that oversight was never designed to question what looks normal. Modern infrastructure depends on movement. Trucks keep shelves stocked. Freight corridors keep cities warm, fed, and functioning. That dependence creates speed, and speed creates blind spots. When systems prioritize efficiency above scrutiny, silence becomes camouflage. This case forced a reckoning, not only for law enforcement, but for regulators, policymakers, and the public itself. Security is no longer confined to borders or ports. It exists along highways, inside supply chains, within the ordinary systems people rely on every day. Threats no longer need to hide. They only need to blend in. Yet there is another lesson, quieter, but no less important. The entire operation unraveled because one routine stop was treated as more than routine, because an officer noticed what didn't feel right, because someone chose to slow down, to question, to look closer, when it would have been easier to move on. In the end, this story isn't about trucks or routes or data. It's about attention. In a world built for speed, vigilance often begins with hesitation, with discomfort, with the willingness to question the ordinary. And that may be the most valuable lesson of all, because when systems are trusted blindly, they can be exploited endlessly. But when ordinary moments are examined carefully, even the most carefully hidden networks can be brought into the light. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment. Let me know what you think. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one. Stories hiding in plain sight.